This is Roll Call for this edition of African Drums. The African drums are sounding.
Drums, the television organ of the Cuffy 250 Committee, an organization dedicated to the empowerment of the African Guyanese community through education and the encouragement of self-activity. I am Elsie and I will be your host for this evening's program. Villages are an integral part of Guyana's cultural and physical landscape. I make bold to say that one cannot adequately speak about the evolution of Guyana from emancipation onwards without locating the villages at the center of that discussion. Coming out of formal enslavement in 1838, the acquisition of land by the freed people became the first major collective manifestation of this freedom. It was this land which they transformed into what we know today as villages. The setting up of these villages was not isolated. Starting with Victoria, this action was soon repeated across the length of the coastland, from Essequibo to the Quarantine. Hence, what historians have called the village movement. In keeping with our mission as a source of historical memory, Cuffy 250 has embraced the village movement as an important historical movement that has significance not only for the 19th century, but for an understanding of contemporary Guyana. Today's edition of African Drums revisits the village movement with one of the foremost writers on the subject, Brother Eusi Kwayana. Brother Eusi is a national figure who is best known as a politician and political activist, but he is also an educator, cultural activist, and author who has written on a range of subjects from history and politics to drama and poetry. His book, Buxton, Friendship in Print and Memory, is a definitive history of the village. He also has a forthcoming book on the village movement based on an interview with Brother David Hines, Cuffy 250 Committee member. Brother Eusi, it is my pleasure to welcome you to African Drums.
Thank you very much, Sister Elsie.
Before we get in...
African Drums.
You're welcome.
Before we get in, indeed, I am not a politician. If I'm a politician, I would have probably had a bank account or something like that. But political actor is a very political person.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so before we get into the meat of the discussion, I'd like to invite our viewers for Brother Eusi's meeting and discussions in Buxton on Monday, the 2nd of June, that's tomorrow, at Brother Dion Abrams Lesson Place in Buxton Public Road, 7 p.m. So make sure you make special effort to attend these discussions. Brother Eusi, as you know, this program is the television organ of the Cuffy 250 Committee, a new organization that is dedicated to encouraging revitalization of African Guyanese communities. What is your opinion on the need to engage Africans in a process of raising consciousness and promoting self-activity?
Do I need to have an opinion on that? I think it is a necessary function of any organization with its eyes open and ears open and with experience of Guyanese life. Okay. And I must congratulate you, especially young people who have taken up this mantle and are getting busy about it.
Thank you.
I think it's necessary. I don't think there's any conflict or controversy about it.
Yes.
And perhaps if you invite me to some of the dissident opinion, I may have an opinion. I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let us now talk about the village movement. Mm-hmm. So there were people who were just coming out of enslavement, and within a matter of a year, they were beginning to set up villages. What accounts for the tremendous drive and foresight on their part?
Thank you. I sometimes am a very talkative person, but my point is I'm a teacher by instinct, you know, and so I want to make sure I explain things and not leave things hanging. I'm glad you put it that way, because they could not have done that overnight.
Yes.
So I think you see right away that something had been going on those plantations during the apprenticeship period, which lasted from 1834 to 1838, in which the former enslaved chattel Africans, they were chattel slaves, that is property. But for this period, after 1834 and the Act of Emancipation, they were simply forced labor. Let us bear this in mind always. They were not free. They were bound to work on their old plantations, and they were bound to work up to 7.5 hours a day. And if they worked more than 7.5 hours a day, they were paid some sort of what we call now overtime wages. But this is overtime to nothing.
Yes.
It is $0 an hour until 7.5 hours, and then, you know, 2 bits or something like that, as we used to say those days, which would mean about 16 cents. I don't have those rates with me. So it was a maneuver. The apprenticeship was a maneuver, and it was partly to please the planters who were raising hell about this act. But you see, it comes down, a lot of people above my generation have a lot of venerance for Queen Victoria, who they said freed the slaves. No, this is just what Queen Victoria did as a British monarch was to sign the order, give assent to the bill, you know, nothing else. She would have been about, she was just in office for 1 year when that happened in 1838. 1837 to 1901, that's when she reigned. So this is fiction, you know, and this is fable. It's a way the British have of promoting their problems, their image and that kind of thing.
Yes.
So there are scholars who have said that if the British had not passed that act, as they say, freeing the slaves, the slaves would have freed themselves.
Okay.
Eric Williams was of that opinion. Rawle Farley of this country was of that opinion. And generally speaking, that was the opinion of those who knew not only Guyana but the region, the so-called British Guyana then. The slaves were up in arms. They were a self-emancipating group, and they were not waiting on anyone to free them, to set them free. And that is a lesson for all time. People have to emancipate themselves. In fact, there is no emancipation that is not self-emancipation. If it's not self-emancipation, watch it. See, nobody gives freedom as a gift.
Yes.
Good. So I suspect that and this is using my own imagination,
yes,
and things that came to light. What comes to light? Victoria was founded by Africans from, I think, 4 plantations. One of them being Dutch 4, and you know, places like that nearby. I think Enmore on the other hand. Nowadays people call Dutch 4, D-O-C-H-F-O-U-R, Dafu. But it's the same place, you know?
Yes.
And what went on there was a lot of networking. There were people who were going from plantation to plantation discussing the future. Africans were a people in the mother continent who were tied to the land. They were born inheriting land. They didn't have to struggle for every inch of land and be robbed right and left by sharks and all sorts of people. Land was an entitlement.
Yes.
If there was nothing else about it, that was one thing. Land was an entitlement, and they had their own systems whereby they would allocate land, whoever was in charge of the family. This land would be allocated as of right. They had their systems of marriage and their systems of community government. The one thing I'm very, very hard on is this question of government and what I call civilization.
Yes.
You know, I have made the claim that this was a civilizing of the Guyana coastland. The only other people here who were civilized were the indigenous people.
Yes.
Because they came down traditionally with their rites, their gods and goddesses and their, you know, their social practices, and that is a civilization. It doesn't have to be like Belgium.
Yes.
You know.
Okay, so this drive and this foresight and civilization was something that was innate to the African people.
Yes, innate.
You argued in the book I referred to in the introduction that the village movement was and is an act of world significance. Can you elaborate on that for us?
I'll be happy to elaborate on it, because this is my whole point. This village movement in this country in particular, and it has not been noted that way, and what I'm writing this interview with Brother David Hines about is to make that point. They wanted to call it something else, and I said, no, this is how Africans in Guyana after emancipation made world history. Yes. Now, my sources, which I want to admit and invite people to investigate themselves, because you can't just listen to a talk and understand or read a book. The first person I read talking about villages was Norman Cameron, N.E. Cameron. He was a very interesting gentleman. He was a professor of mathematics. He went to London to study mathematics and won prizes. Came back here, and his interest went far beyond mathematics. He wrote two volumes called The Evolution of the Negro. In those days, Negro was a decent word for the other N-word, as they call it in the United States of America. So when he said evolution of the Negro, he was using uplifting language.
Yes.
You see, because apart from that, it was nigger. So he wrote these two volumes, which I preserve until this day, and will do anything to get. In fact, I had to get some photostat copies while going through this interview. He was a teacher. He was interested in drama, and he began to write history. And he wrote history for the same purpose that we are discussing this now. He was not what most people will call a radical or anything like that, but he may well have been radical in his day.
Yes.
But he documented what was going on, and fortunately put some documents from the public area, like editorials and so on, into his book. That was one source. The other source that really galvanized me to get riveted into this thing was Alan Young. Alan Young was a Guyanese land surveyor. If you looked at him, he looked like a mixture of Chinese and African. I knew him personally.
Yes.
And he got some kind of scholarship and went to England, and this was his treatise, Approaches to Local Self-Government in Guyana. Sounds very innocent, and you know, it is innocent to a certain extent, but data, a lot of information. The acreages of the villages, the prices, the land values, how they fluctuated because of the village movement, population figures, all sorts of things. People who are scholarly or just curious will like to look at that book. It's a very interesting book, and it really turned me on. After reading that book, I understood that this was a revolution, a social revolution that had taken place. Not just one writer, Dr. Jagan, in his first book, Forbidden Freedom, has a passage which he corrected later on into his credit in the West on Trial, and had some of what we are discussing here.
Yes.
Because, I had become very overt on this question at all levels. He had said the Africans left the plantations and took to the villages. It would seem that there were villages there for them to take to, And so he had missed this whole point of the whole effort, the whole sort of space of time and development that went into that residence, that new residence in the villages. Another fiction is that the Africans walked off the sugar estates. And this is a very interesting fiction because it was used to win support for immigration, the indentured in immigration, in which people would come bound for so many years and then be free. The first set of indentures were, of course, from Madeira, the Portuguese, and what is interesting about that is that immigration, that indentures process did not await the end of the apprenticeship system. They were landed here first in 1835, whereas apprenticeship ended in 1838.
Oh.
So the villagers, they did their networking, and the most important part of it that people like to know, where you got the money to buy these villages.
Yes.
They were faced with a challenge. The colonial government, and this is what I learned from Alan Young, and this is what made me see everything clearly. Colonial government also had been prepared for the end of enslavement, and to prepare themselves properly, and their allies, their co-nationals on the plantation, with which they could not always agree because the British government at that time had another temper, had this emancipation temper. They passed ordinances through the local legislature, whatever it was at the time. I think it was called the Combined Court, making it illegal for any person. They're not making race laws, like in South Africa.
Yes.
But no person could buy more than under 100 acres of crown land.
So they had to buy above.
They had to buy
acres.
more than 100 acres.
Yes.
At, I think, £1 an acre. So this is not a race law, but whom did it affect? These penniless people coming off the plantations who didn't want to stay there or stay there entirely. So the British put this block in the way right away. They knew from their sociological study and their colonial occupation that Africans were tied to land.
Yes.
This idea that people have that Africans disdain the land, that they steer farming. I grew up in Buxton. I left Lusitania at the age of 7. As a columnist in Guyana Times was kind to remind me and remind the world, showing that he knows everything about me, which he doesn't, that I grew up in Buxton, and almost every household had a patch of land in the rear of the village, to the south of the village, and had some ambitions about farming.
Yes.
At 5 o'clock in the morning, 5 to 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, the Company Canal, which was a main navigation and irrigation waterway, would be, all you would see there is boats, bateaus going about. And in my time, those bateaus were not only Africans, but Indians who very often had canoes, and they would all be trekking in one direction. So that is a significant thing. They had to struggle against those measures.
Yes.
And my answer to that, my solution to that, which Alan Young did not say. And when I did meet him at something at the Village Council Buxton after he had written the book, he asked me if I'd seen it. I said, yes, and you would like to see what I'm doing with it. I wasn't writing this then, but I was writing things,
Yes.
And this is what I meant. Now, so that is the first thing. They had to resist the plans of the plantation.
Yes.
Not all of...
What did they do? Since they couldn't purchase land unless it was above 100 acres.
Yeah, my answer is that they applied their African memory,
Yes.
which nobody can take a picture of,
Yes.
but it's in the bones, it's in the soul. And they practice as much of it as possible,
Yes.
even in their enslavement. They could not marry until 1825. They could not marry. So they were denied the right to have a normal family.
Yes.
Of course, they had families, but they abuse Africans now for having, children here and there. And it's not the best way to organize a family.
Yes.
But they had to fight against all of that. Marriage
Yes.
was very late permitted. And then, during the apprenticeship system, certain things happened. We can't leave out the 1823 uprising on the East Coast. I know there's an organization here, 1823. What's the name of it? The 1823 organization, celebrating that was an uprising that stretched from about Chateau Margaux, Les Riveniers, right through to Mahaika. Every plantation was organized for that uprising. And it was not an uprising with arms. It was an uprising which they had planned to take possession of the whites
Yes.
and keep them under restraint until they got what was due to them, which they felt had been passed by the British Parliament. But the whole thing I want to say about apprenticeship is these overtime wages.
Yes.
The Africans, out of those miserly wages, saved.
Yes.
They saved and saved and saved because they knew that this life was not for them. This was not how they were. This life is not for them. And that they had to have money in this kind of economy in order to do anything relating to land and property and movement and so on. So I think a most significant part of it was the fact that they were prepared for this. And the government did not know.
Yes.
This was an underground movement.
Yes.
It was a clandestine underground movement from the time of the Reverend John Smith in 1823 until 1838. And this is why it was so much a surprise. They tried to maneuver them into all sorts of outcomes. They wanted them to go into a sort of village run by the church. This is what they had in Jamaica.
Yes.
In Jamaica, they had a powerful village movement. But when you looked at the financing, it was financed largely by the Baptist Church, who gave loans to enslaved and emancipated people to set up villages. Now that in itself was a significant movement,
Yes.
but this here, we went beyond that.
Yes.
So that is a second reason why I call it a movement of world significance. It was their own money. They negotiated with plantation owners.
Yes.
I've looked carefully to see the role played by missionaries. There is not much of it. The missionaries wanted to push them into these parish villages where the church would dominate. Later on, of course, the church was very influential. And it's the congregational ministers who really threw in their lot with the Africans. The congregational ministers, not the high church, the Anglican and the Roman. The Anglican is the one in which I grew up. But it was the congregational ministers that were the stalwarts standing by the side. And the other source was History of the Guyanese Working People, Walter Rodney,
Yes.
which does not appear to be talking about villages, but it is riddled with information about villages and especially about stalwarts like Reverend Glasgow, who were side by side with these post-emancipation Africans, helping them to, to organize and perhaps using the church as a kind of forum as well. So I would say they used their African memory, and they may not have called it that, and came together and bought plots of land to which they had identified. And what helped in this case was also that plantation owners were going bankrupt and they wanted to sell. So there was a conflict about them. The government wasn't keen for them to sell, but they wanted to sell and get out because they had no future, because of things that were happening in England. In England, the capitalist class. You want to interrupt me, I see.
No,
go ahead.
Proceed. No, Brother Eusi, this show is about hearing from you, getting information from you, so continue.
The rising capitalist class in England
yes.
did not like the fact that they had to buy things from British colonies when they could perhaps get them cheaper.
Yes.
Moreover, the British colonies had passed this act of emancipation, and they felt the price of sugar would go up, because now it's not free work, free labor anymore.
Yes.
You had to pay for labor. Even in the indentured, laborers were paid, and they were not free, although they were compelled to work. So this kind of conflict, and our foreparents were able to make very good use of this contradiction and this conflict in the ranks of the rulers.
So what we're seeing here is various levels of skills that the African people portrayed. They started a social revolution. They exhibited their independence and their economic finesse because they had to pool resources,
yes, they had to
which
pool
were
money.
very limited, and they used these resources to purchase the villages.
Yeah.
If you are just joining us, this is African Drums, the television organ of the Cuffy 250 Committee. I am Elsie Harry, and we are discussing the village movement with Brother Eusi Kwayana. We'll take a short break. Please stay tuned.
How much time have we got?
This is Roll Call for this edition of African Drums. The African drums are sounding.
Welcome back to African Drums, the television organ of the Cuffy 250 Committee. I am Elsie Harry, and I'd just like to take this opportunity to let our viewers know that the Cuffy 250 Committee invites your participation in our second education forum to discuss the state of education in our communities and to plan to do something about it. The location is the St. Mark's Annex, Public Road, Stanley Town, West Bank, Demerara, on Sunday, June 8th, 2014. That's Sunday, June 8th, 2014, from 2 to 5 p.m. The presenters include Brother Kidaki Amsterdam and Mr. Aubrey Norton. We are discussing the village movement here on African Drums with Brother Eusi Kwayana. And before we went to the break, Brother Eusi was telling me that the Africans actually pooled their resources to buy villages because of the ordinance that said that they could not purchase land under 100 acres, and it was really expensive, so they had to have some sort of mechanism to purchase this land. Just a few weeks ago on the show, we discussed the history of cooperatives in Guyana. Would you say that this was the beginning of corporatism in Guyana?
It was the beginning of on the coast of cooperative movements.
Yes.
It was the first and very massive cooperative movement.
Yes.
And they had no ordinance to guide them.
Yes.
They had to make their own rules. Before that, I want to clear up this fiction that Africans, it's written in such raw terms. The Africans were lazy. They
Yes.
did not want to work. They left the plantation, so we have to go and look for indentured. What the plantation wanted was unfree labor.
Yes.
And what they did not like about the Africans was not that they had withdrawn all their labor, because they had not, but they worked as they wanted.
Yes.
They exercised freedom that they did not have for centuries.
Yes.
So they would work on their own farms in these villages, and at times that suited them, perhaps when there was a sugar crop to cut canes, they would go to the estates, make the money, and get the working capital.
Yes.
Alan Young made the part very starkly that the Africans had exhausted all their savings in acquiring land and had nothing left for working capital. See, that was the key to the whole thing. So
Yes.
they got working capital by going and working on the plantations. They knew the work.
Yes.
And they had the village gang, the Boxing gang, Victoria gang, this gang, Plaisance gang. They would go there and do the shovel work, the cane cutting and everything. And it took some time for the indentured population to build up to a point of, not being able to rely on Africans. In fact, in my entire experience, there was not a time when they did not, to some extent, rely on African labor. And what they began to do, of course, was to put them in competition, because the indentured Indians could not bargain. They had to take it as it was.
Yes.
And when people talk of the race problem of today and think perhaps it is due to our wickedness or something like that, what the British did, Indians, I pointed out in 1988, they came under a special dispensation. There was a special set of laws for indentured labor.
Laborers. Yes.
And so they had to stick to those laws. They were not in a single community. You can call it whatever they want to call it, but that was the fact. So I want to clear up this thing about lazy Africans.
Yes.
If you see the literature, how they wanted to go up the rivers, many of them did go up the river, and it was said that they went up there because they didn't want to work. They wanted to work for themselves. This is what Africans do in the mother continent. This is what they had done for centuries.
Yes.
Good. Let us leave that now and go to the to how they ran the villages, because
Sure.
you emphasized the point about the financing.
Yes.
Well, it's self-financing and self-government,
Yes.
because there was no charter for them to follow.
Yes.
There was no charter for them to follow. The governor and those people had their own ideas, but the villagers, and here we have to honor Victoria. And when I say honor Victoria, as the British honor the Magna Carta,
The rule of
which
law.
is the Great Chart,
Yes.
and as the Americans honor their Declaration of Independence for some at the time, and wrote those glowing phrases about, human rights and that sort of thing. We have to honor Victoria, because buying land and settling on the land and stretching it out throughout the country was one part of it. The second part was running the village.
Yes.
Now here I must divert to say that this was only one type of village. One great thing, one part of the richness of this movement is that it was not a single monolithic one type thing. It was pluralist. People used various strategies to get into villages. But when they got there, the spirit was largely the same.
Yes.
There was no central committee, no political party with a central committee passing a resolution saying we go there tomorrow, we go there, we go to Transgrove. No, none of that. These were people acting spontaneously
But still collectively.
with their own inherent culture,
Yes.
directing them to combine and solve the social problems. Now, the Victorians did a remarkable thing. And I don't know why people did not pick it up earlier, but the rules that they set out, the Victoria rules we call them. Tommy Paine has written quite a lot about this too. Very, very learned on this matter. The Victorians made a constitution. They sat down and made a constitution. And the constitution had it had an executive, and it had the electorate. It had divisions of power that were surprising and to some extent modern governments have not had. I'm not saying, I know that the modern government in Guyana would be ruling an entire country.
Yes.
And they were ruling only a village.
Yes.
But the principle was there. And any serious set of revolutionaries that say they're revolutionary and they want to, to be authentic and to establish self-determination, would look at their own history and not the Soviet Union or North Korea or wherever, because the first thing is what have our own people produced and donated to us. The Victoria Constitution, and of course, there were people looking on at government. I'm not saying that all of this was out of their imagination.
Yes.
But what they did with their governmental experience, looking on at the combined court and how, how they maneuvered and all of that, was remarkable. And I have searched everywhere. There is no claim even. There were hints by some writers, but there's no claim that they were assisted in this in any way by missionaries or government officials. What the government did was to appoint magistrates called stipendiary magistrates, located them at places near to villages so that issues with legal implication could be settled.
Yes.
And the Africans, of course, who largely could not read and write English, took advantage of these things. They were entitled to them. The only money in the form of aid in the first, I would say, virtually the first half century that came to the emancipated Africans was for education. And even with that, emancipated Africans up to late in the 19th century paid fees for primary education. Since I came and met one or two groups, I'm hearing the word education over and over.
Yes.
And so I'm deliberately saying this: education is in fact necessary.
Yes.
At all levels: social, school education, secondary, higher education, social education, political education, very, very necessary. And the Africans in those days had something called the African Night School.
Okay.
The African Night School was an institution that they founded. And the names of the persons connected with that, one being a priest, the names of those are documented by Norman Cameron.
Yes.
We can't go into that kind of fine detail now. But this constitution in Victoria was very interesting because everybody, it was bought by shareholders.
Yes.
So each shareholder got a piece of the property, the land, according to what they had put in. It was not egalitarian. They did not have an equal amount of money to put in.
Yes.
Therefore, who put 700 guilders would get twice as much as who put 350 guilders. That is what I meant. But the remarkable thing is, and this is where they foresaw the modern cooperative movement, that extra land that you had, that bigger amount of land, did not entitle you to any further rights.
Yes.
Than perhaps the rights you could get from from cultivating the land. You
Yes.
see, everybody had one vote for every proprietor. And whereas the national system was denying votes to women here in England, in the USA, I investigated it. They said every proprietor. It did not occur to them to ban women from the vote. It did not occur to them. I'm not saying they were feminists or anything like that.
Yes.
I'm not saying they were males. They were not males as males are now,
Yes.
with all the, all the male things about it. But because of how they were developed socially, the women worked in the fields, the men worked in the field or the boiler house or where, and they were therefore equal.
Yes.
They were equal as apprentices, they were equal as proprietors, they were equal as shareholders, and they were now equal as local citizens.
Yes.
Citizens is an importation on my part because the law called them subjects,
Yes.
and other people would have called them less than that.
So it's amazing to note that the slaves, the ex-slaves, who some people claimed were uncivilized, exhibited these actions of higher levels of civilization over matters that even now, in 2014,
Yes.
we have
Conflict.
issues with, conflicts over.
Precisely.
Okay, Brother
Yes.
Eusi, no doubt the act of setting up villages what did not go unchallenged by the plantocracy. For example, you spoke about the issue of where they were not allowed to buy land unless it was over 100 acres. What other methods of retaliation did the plantocracy use against the ex-slaves?
First of all, they controlled the legislature. The people who were elected were mostly planter people,
Yes.
and so they could suppress anything that was beneficial to the villagers. That is, at that level, they could punish villagers by denying them drainage. This big Atlantic Ocean out there, the Africans didn't put it there. They were the ones who were used to build up the sea defenses.
Yes.
In those days, not of concrete, but of mud and earth, and trees and that sort of thing. All their labor had gone into that, digging the canals and all of that.
Yes.
But what the plantations did practically to villages was to use their power of control over drainage, very often to flood their crops out and drive them back to the plantation at a time when the plantation owners needed cheaper labor,
Yes.
and do that. That was a major plank in the whole thing, major plank. And anything in the way of reform that was to benefit the villagers, they used their votes in the combined court to obstruct. The governance, I'm not quite finished with that.
Okay,
They
proceed.
had a very interesting principle that every 6 months, you had to elect an executive,
Yes.
president, vice president, treasurer, and that sort of body,
Yes.
which is the executive of the village. So they had an executive, they had the electorate, and they had an arrangement for settling disputes, which you can call the elements of a judiciary.
Yes.
If you had disputes between two proprietors, they would go to the chairman, and he would call the council, and they would appoint a smaller committee. And if the two did not agree, this is a kind of arbitration, the two of them would choose a third person to make it three to sit. So this is the genius of government,
Yes.
nothing short of it. But another important institution in those documents, in that constitution, was every 6 months they had to call the villagers together.
Yes.
That is the council, the meeting, the executive would call the councillors together, call the villagers together, and listen to the villagers, the opinions of the villagers on the administration of the village. If you look at that and translate it into current terms,
Yes.
you see how powerful it is. It is giving the ordinary taxpayers the right of review of the acts of the executive. Something I understand that is much resented, has always been resented here
Yes.
since we became, officially civilized, so to speak. So those are things I think are unique.
Yes.
I haven't found them anywhere else,
Yes.
and I feel that only in those villages in those days could we talk of civilization. Anything else was the barbarism of the plantation, and the barbarism of the plantation was immense. It's not ordinary, It's the big manager was the voice of everyone. He could
Yes.
he could evict people from the estate. Up to the 1940s, a manager could evict residents from the estate if they were too troublesome, getting into strikes and that kind of thing, you know. So that was what it was like in the days of the village system, which I think is the golden age of Africans in this country.
If you are just joining us, this is African Drums, the television organ of the Cuffy 250 Committee. I am Elsie Harry, and we're discussing the village movement with Brother Eusi Kwayana. I'd just like to take this opportunity to invite you to a workshop on cooperatives, the way forward, at Critchlow Labour College from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. on Sunday, 8th June. The panelists include Vincent Alexander and Raul Lucas. Okay, Brother Eusi. Villages have changed over the decades. Can you do a comparison of villages back then and villages in today's society?
Not a very accurate one, because I've not been here for over a decade.
Yes.
Contrary to all my plans.
Yes.
I never planned to be living abroad in my life, you know,
Yes.
and it was at the age of 78 that I thought I visited and thought it fit not to return. Well, from what I hear, I better talk of what I know. In those days, a village council was like a little parliament.
Yes.
And it was given that recognition by the press, the national media. The book I'm writing ends on this note.
Yes.
You have a village council meeting at Plaisance at Shitanka, which was a very, lively council. At Queenstown and Sikibo, I'd begun to talk of another model of villages, and that was the Queenstown model. But I don't think we'll get there in this short interview. But wherever things were going on, the councillors would go discuss their business. The reporters of the Guyana the Daily Chronicle and the Daily Argosy were there and would report. And in the next few days, these matters were printed in the newspapers. What's the importance of that? The whole country knew that there were people governing these, 80-odd little spots, and could not therefore have a false impression about them, because they're seeing them. It was like a little parliament, and they would meet and discuss and sometimes have their noise and walkouts and all sorts of things, anything. And the local politicians who went into the combined court kept in very close touch with these local councillors, because it was not universal adult suffrage. It was a limited franchise, and these were the people they felt could point them around to who had the vote.
Yes.
Those who had enough income and property to vote. So the village councils did a lot on their own. They learned all sorts of things. And as I said the other day, in the case of Buxton, they founded the Buxton Scholarship.
Yes.
Which sent a lot of people year after year, people of all races too. It was founded by Africans, and Africans were the main beneficiaries, but if you were a Buxtonian or of Buxtonian parentage, you had a right to enter the Buxton Scholarship, and you could win. And I was saying BBG Nihal, the first government bacteriologist and pathologist, was a product of the Buxton Scholarship, as well as people like Mr. Haslin Paris and many others we can think of who came through that route.
Okay. The Cuffy 250 Committee, one of its main goals is education. Mm-hmm. You spoke a little about the village night school. Can you tell us what was taught in this night school?
The African night school, I
Yes.
don't know. I just know of its existence through Norman Cameron, the only source
Yes.
that gave me that information. But clearly it was, well, literacy was very high, teaching people to read and write.
Yes.
I'm sure was one of those things, teaching people to read and write. And that is why Africans in the early decades were noted for a high rate of literacy, very high rate of literacy that began to go down after independence, remarkably. Yeah. I know in the places close to me, I can tell you what went on there. They had organizations like the Women's Institutes,
Yes.
and I'm talking about the 1940s and onward. Village institutes, you had improvement association. Every village would have an improvement association. That spoke for itself.
Yes.
You went there to discuss. A favorite topic was this: whither are we drifting? You could tell you invite anybody to speak. The topic is going to be whither are we drifting? And I heard this the other night and I was very amused. Everybody had that concern: where are we going?
Yes.
You know? And a lot of adults, people of various age groups would get into those organizations. There were also young people's organizations in which they might have had sort of monitors and mentors, but by and large they carried their own organization and took decisions what to do and what not to do, exercising the right of self-determination.
Yes.
You know, that's practicing exercising the right of self-determination.
A village is considered to be a unique space. What, in your opinion, makes a village unique?
I am too much of a village fanatic to ask me that. It's not a fair question. I would say everything. Everything. People tend to know one another.
Yes.
There is a kind of village mood, you know?
Yes.
Kind of village mood that is universal within the boundaries of the village. There's a lot of mutual assistance and mutual aid, you know? You going to school and you're misbehaving on the road, a big woman would call you and scold you. And if necessary, she would punish you. And if you went home and complained to your mother, you got another dose of it. You see, they were entitled to do that. They felt entitled to do that. So
Yes.
anybody would correct anybody's child on the road.
Yes.
That was another thing. Of course, there was corporal punishment, which was a very ugly descent. That came from slavery, the
Yes.
slave system. They did a lot of flogging there. And so getting power in the hands of a new class, getting power, very often uses the old techniques, because you can't make a technique overnight, and they continued the flogging and felt it was such a wonderful way to train with pain, you know, rather than train without pain. So that's a village.
Can you tell us about the village economy? We know that the ex-slaves used most of their money that they had saved from apprenticeship to actually buy these villages.
Yeah.
So what did the typical village economy look like?
There's a chapter in that book, Books on Friendship in Print and Memory, which is, I think, typical. First of all, agriculture.
Yes.
The whole thing was based on farming, as we called it, farming. And the crops were, they planted a lot of fruit crops. Mango was a bit, mango and coconuts. Those were, they called those the sort of long-term crops, because they didn't produce in a year or anything like that. They hadn't grafted and all of that in those days. So they thought they were planting those for the future. For the current crops were ground provisions, greens, ground provisions, other kinds of vegetables, and the cash crops were sugarcane. Sugarcane was the cash crop. And another cash crop, not really a crop, livestock, was pigs. So on the basis of pigs and cane farming, they found lump sums of money periodically to educate children when they had to send them to high school, in particular when they had to buy clothing, you know. These were the avenues from which they got lump sums of money. You bring cassava and plantains and so on from the farm and sell in the market. Or there was also fish. We had a lot of fisher people with fishing boats, and they go to sea and they come back and they sell their fish. But unless you had these cash crops in which you could get a lump of money, because you're planting, say, 2 beds of cane,
Yes.
and when that is cut at the orders of the plantation, you have agents coming around and tell you when to load it at the point it goes to the plantation, they calculate it, and you get a lump sum of money for the total crop, which you would not get weekly. You see the point?
Yes.
So that is where a little bit of small capital came from.
Yes.
But if I may add to this, there was also self-help included in that. In
Yes.
addition to all of that, the Denamstel, this model came from Denamstel now. Mr. What's his name? He was a local government activist at Denamstel who was also a justice of the peace and all of that. And this was not original, but he applied it in an original way. He copied a banking system from Germany
Yes.
and brought it here. And he's the founder of the Village Chairman's Conference. He discussed it there, and they embraced it. And these same people who had bought the villages now established their own bank, their
Wow.
own banking system throughout the coast. Dr. Simmons from the University of Guyana has done a good research, the most up-to-date research on those banks. They call them the cooperative credit banks. And this was a self-promoted bank. And I want to say 2 things here and now. Into many of these African villages came people from the indentured groups who came afterwards, Portuguese, Indians, and to a very small extent Chinese, and found places in these villages. The civilization that I boasted about extended to accommodating people who would be seen as strangers, and they were able to come in and take part in the life of the community.
Yes.
It is not that they were restricted in any way. They had the same rights as citizens. You know, they say teeth and tongue must bite, but they were fully integrated as far as possible. They had their own religion, sometimes their own mosque, but the same village council. Some of them became councillors. And that, I think, was to the credit of Africans.
Yes.
Because when we look around and see the world and see a lot of bigotry and oppression, you know, and resistance to demarcation and all that sort of thing, it is good to know that our own people at some point set an example, you know.
Yes.
And one of the things I value most about all that Walter Rodney said is this line: Africans came out of slavery with dignity. You know, that is a volume, and it answers all the stereotypes that have been accumulating.
Okay. As we conclude this evening's program, what message would you like to leave with villagers and other people watching this program?
Oh, I don't leave messages. I should like to say, I haven't done so before, sisters and brothers and ladies and gentlemen listening, wherever you are, thank you very much for listening if you did. And all I want to do is to encourage you in the good things that you are trying to do. If you are a villager, think carefully about who you are. You know, think carefully about it. I think the place to begin is to come together and talk. Come together and discuss, review. You're close to one another, you have the same experiences. This chap coming here after so many years can't be suggesting what you can do.
Yes.
You know, the ideas I have, I will surely pass on to organized groups. As I said somewhere else, suppose I have an idea that you can make mud pies. I say there's a market for mud pies in the United States of America. And I put it out on this program. Villagers should make mud pies to take themselves out of the economic disaster and doldrums, who is going to move first with the mud pies? The people who are already organized in business and with money. And by the time you have your meetings and savings and everything and come together, the mud pie market is taken up by those with the ready energy, you know. This is something they have to their credit, whoever they are, but I'm not going there. I'm not doing that. So I just want to encourage people in your present state of being to keep on the struggle. It's not new. It is more and more uphill. I have been here, I have lived here, and I know what struggle is. And I look at the news and what the young people have to cope with today, I told a few of them, is extraordinary and very unfair. Very, very unfair. We did not have to fight such battles. We had to fight battles, but I mean, this is not battle. This is something that is getting chronic, you know, and the only answer to it is organization, especially what I hear some people are doing. And this is not the place for me to say it, but if there is time I will say it. I think when I came here in 2011 for my brother's funeral, there had been an election. I had never seen people so at peace in Guyana since the 1960s. When I mean so at peace, well, because there was very little anxiety. I stayed in Buxton all the time. I met a whole set of young people, not a word of bitterness. Their presidential candidate did not win. They were not bitter. And I felt it was because they knew that they had done their best and they had won a certain victory in the assembly, in the National Assembly. But my great regret is that nothing has been made of this victory. The parties winning this victory are doing things that could not be done before, that is true. But there is something deeper than that in what we are calling democracy. And that thing deeper than that is that government, according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government, and it shall be expressed in periodic and fair elections. What did that 2011 election express? It did not give the president's party a majority of votes. So tell me, by what arithmetic do they have the entire cabinet? By what arithmetic could they have 100% of the cabinet with 40-something% of the will of the people?
Yes.
You see where I'm getting
Yes.
at? And that is the government, the cabinet. And the second leg of that is that many people are suggesting that the Constitution does not allow it. I say that is the number one falsehood of this part of the century. The Constitution provides that the president, after being declared, before he embarks on his duties as president, must take the oath of office, and that he shall appoint a cabinet from among the members of the National Assembly. It has nothing about the president's list. And anyone who is telling you that it has to be from the president's list is not telling you what the Constitution says.
Yeah.
I'm talking about Article 103.
And we've noticed that in the village movement, there was clear organizational structure, much unlike what you just pointed out right now. Thank you, Brother Eusi Kwayana, for being on the program this evening, discussing the village movement with us, talking about its organization, its structure, and things that we have gotten out of this village movement. As we end this evening's program, I just want to remind our villagers that the Cuffy 250 Committee invites your participation in our second education forum to discuss the state of education in our communities and to do something about it. The place, the St. Mark's Annex, Public Road, Stanley Town, West Bank, Demerara, Sunday, June 8th, 2014, 2 to 5 p.m. And please visit Brother Eusi's meetings on Buxton Public Road at Dion Abrams Lesson Place tomorrow at 7 p.m.
And thank you, Sister Elsie, for guiding me through this discussion.
No problem. Viewers, please like our Facebook page, Cuffy 250, and please check our YouTube channel, Cuffy 250, for videos of the show. And for other information, please email us at cuffy250gy@gmail.com to get involved or to donate. Thank you for staying with us. Please stay tuned to Channel 9.